The map room at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters fell silent on February 2nd, 1943. The radio had just confirmed what every officer already feared. The Sixth Army at Stalingrad had been completely destroyed. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the massive situation map where an entire army group had simply ceased to exist. He had warned them. He had sent desperate cables begging for permission to break through to the trapped forces. Now, as the final casualty reports began arriving, a chilling realization spread through the German high command. This wasn't just a defeat, it was the beginning of the end. The professional soldiers who had engineered Germany's early victories now faced their darkest hour, serving a commander who refused to acknowledge reality while their nation marched towards certain destruction. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder of unimaginable proportions. As spring thaw turned roads to mud in March 1943, Manstein orchestrated what historians would later call his masterpiece, the Third Battle of Kharkov. In a stunning display of tactical brilliance, his exhausted forces recaptured the city, temporarily stabilizing the collapsing front. But behind this victory lay a terrifying truth. During the operation, Manstein's staff officers compiled secret reports showing Soviet reserves outnumbered German forces by 5-1. Their assessment concluded that even perfect German tactics could only delay, not prevent, ultimate defeat. These documents were circulated among senior commanders but never reached Hitler, who would have dismissed them as defeatist nonsense. The summer of 1943 brought the final confirmation at Kursk. General Heinz Guderian, recently appointed Inspector General of Armored Troops, argued passionately against Operation Citadel. "The attack is pointless," he told Hitler during a tense conference. "Our intelligence shows the Soviets have prepared defensive positions up to 300 kilometers deep. They know we're coming, they know our strength, and they're waiting." Hitler dismissed Guderian's concerns, obsessed with his new Panther and Tiger tanks. The resulting battle became the death knell for German offensive capability. After 1 week of brutal fighting, the German panzer divisions had been gutted. Guderian's private notes from July 13, 1943, reveal his despair. "Our armored forces are finished. We have sacrificed our last reserves for nothing. The Eastern Front can no longer be saved through military means." While disaster unfolded in Russia, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel conducted his own grim assessment in the West. Touring the Atlantic Wall from Denmark to Brittany, he found the defenses utterly inadequate. More alarmingly, his analysis of Allied air power revealed a devastating truth. In a confidential memo to his staff, Rommel wrote, "Without air superiority, our coastal defenses are meaningless. The enemy will destroy our mobility before we can even engage their landing forces." His requests for additional aircraft and anti-aircraft batteries were routinely denied, with Hitler's staff insisting the real threat remained in the east. Rommel began keeping a private diary, documenting the growing gap between military reality and Hitler's delusions. The economic picture completed this triangle of doom. Despite Albert Speer's much-publicized production miracles, Germany's war economy faced fundamental weaknesses. Secret reports from the Armaments Ministry showed oil production had fallen to 40% of military requirements. The transportation network was collapsing under constant aerial bombardment. Most tellingly, the quality of German manpower had deteriorated dramatically. Veteran non-commissioned officers, the backbone of any army, had been largely wiped out and replaced by conscripts with minimal training. General Alfred Jodel's war diary entry from November 1943 captures the growing despair. The Führer speaks of miracle weapons, while our soldiers lack winter coats and our panzers sit idle for want of fuel. By December 1943, the evidence became overwhelming. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, head of Foreign Armies East Intelligence, compiled a comprehensive assessment showing Soviet tank production exceeded Germany's by 8-1. American aircraft production outpaced German output by 5-1. The report concluded that even if Germany achieved perfect tactical success everywhere, mathematical certainty guaranteed defeat within 12 to 18 months. This assessment was shared secretly among senior field commanders, but deliberately kept from Hitler, who had previously threatened to execute officers presenting defeatist intelligence. The atmosphere at military conferences grew increasingly surreal. Hitler would rant for hours about Frederick the Great and the power of will, while his generals stood in silent frustration. They had visited the fronts, spoken with the soldiers, seen the destroyed equipment. They understood that willpower couldn't stop a T-34 tank, that determination couldn't manufacture aviation fuel. After one particularly disastrous conference, where Hitler refused to authorize any withdrawals despite catastrophic losses, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge confided to his chief of staff, "We are no longer soldiers, but accomplices in a suicide pact. The man is determined to destroy Germany and take us all with him." The snow fell silently on Berlin the night of January 10, 1944, as Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg arrived at a discreet villa in the Dahlem district. Inside, he found a gathering of Germany's most respected military minds, men who had come to a terrible conclusion. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, General Ludwig Beck, and Admiral Wilhelm Canaris sat in the dimly lit study, their faces grave. They weren't plotting treason, but grappling with a moral dilemma of historic proportions. How does a soldier save his country from its own leader? The conversation that night would set in motion events that would ultimately determine Germany's fate. Stauffenberg, though still recovering from severe wounds that cost him an eye and a hand, had become the conspiracy's driving force. His transformation from loyal officer to determined resistor reflected the journey many were taking. In private letters to his wife, he wrote, "I cannot stand by while this madman destroys our nation. The time has come for action, whatever the personal cost." His moral clarity inspired others who had been hesitating. What made Stauffenberg particularly dangerous to the regime was his new position as Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Olbricht, head of the replacement army, giving him access to both Hitler and the machinery needed for a coup. Field Marshal Rommel's conversion proved equally significant. The Desert Fox had been one of Hitler's favorites, his face plastered across Nazi propaganda posters. But command reality in France stripped away his illusions. His private diary entries from early 1944 show his growing alarm. "The war is lost militarily and economically. Every day we continue means thousands more German deaths for nothing." Rommel began using his influence to sway other Western Front commanders. In confidential meetings with General Hans Speidel and Colonel General Johannes Blaskowitz, he argued for opening separate peace negotiations with the Western Allies. "We must save what can be saved," he told them. "The alternative is total destruction." The conspiracy's operational planning advanced with painstaking caution. General Olbricht and his deputy, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, began modifying existing contingency plans, originally designed to suppress civil unrest, that could be used to seize government centers. Codenamed Operation Valkyrie, these plans provided legal cover for their preparations. They worked with exquisite care, knowing a single misplaced document or careless remark could doom them all. Security measures included using only trusted messengers, holding meetings in private homes rather than offices, and communicating through coded phrases in routine military correspondence. The military situation continued to deteriorate in exactly the ways the conspirators had predicted. On the Eastern Front, Army Group Center faced imminent collapse as Soviet forces prepared for their summer offensive. Manstein's repeated desperate requests to withdraw to the Dnieper River line were denied, guaranteeing another Stalingrad-scale disaster. Each refusal strengthened the conspirators' conviction that Hitler had to be removed. General Henning von Tresckow, operations officer for Army Group Center, told Stauffenberg during a secret meeting, "We must prove to the world that not all Germans followed Hitler like sheep to the slaughter. Someone must dare to act." The economic reports circulating among staff officers painted an even grimmer picture. Germany's synthetic fuel production had fallen to 35% of military needs, meaning trained pilots sat grounded while Allied bombers destroyed German cities. Steel production plummeted as coal shipments failed to reach factories. The transportation system neared complete breakdown. These weren't temporary setbacks, but terminal symptoms of a dying war economy. The conspirators collected and shared these reports, using them to convince hesitant officers that action had become necessary for national survival. Rommel took his most daring step on May 15, 1944, drafting a memorandum that he and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt both signed. The document presented to Hitler was breathtaking in its directness. The situation on the Western Front demands immediate political action. Military victory is no longer possible. We must seek a negotiated peace before the enemy lands in France. Hitler received the report with visible fury, accusing both field marshals of cowardice before a room full of junior officers. The public humiliation proved decisive. Rommel now knew beyond doubt that reason had no place in Hitler's world. The conspiracy faced its ultimate test when Allied forces stormed ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944. The battle unfolded exactly as Rommel had predicted. Allied air power prevented German reinforcements from reaching the front, and within weeks the defense collapsed. As the situation grew desperate, Hitler issued increasingly insane orders, demanding counterattacks that couldn't be mounted, refusing tactical withdrawals that might save entire armies. With each passing day, more officers recognized the terrible truth they had been avoiding. The time for warnings had passed, the time for action had arrived, and the clock was ticking toward midnight for Germany. The Situation Conference at Berchtesgaden on June 17, 1944, began like dozens of others. Hitler stood before his massive situation map, pointer in hand, while his generals arranged themselves in their customary semicircle. But what followed would become one of the most dramatic confrontations of the war. Field Marshals Rommel and Rundstedt had traveled from France, determined to make Hitler understand the catastrophe unfolding in Normandy. Rommel spoke first, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Mein Führer," he began, "the situation in Normandy grows more critical by the hour. Our divisions are being systematically destroyed. Without immediate withdrawal to defensible positions, we will lose everything." Hitler listened with growing agitation, his hands beginning to tremble. When Rundstedt added his assessment, confirming Rommel's dire warnings, something in Hitler snapped. "Lies!" he screamed, striking the map table with his fist. "You are both cowards. The troops simply need to fight harder." For 20 minutes, he raved about willpower and betrayal, while the generals stood in stunned silence. Then Rommel did something no officer had ever done. He interrupted the Führer. "The war cannot be won through willpower alone," he insisted. "We face mathematical certainty, not a crisis of morale." The room fell deathly quiet. Hitler's face turned purple with rage as he dismissed both field marshals, ending the conference in total breakdown. This confrontation marked the final rupture between Hitler and his professional soldiers. Rundstedt resigned that evening, telling his staff, "I cannot serve a man who lives in a fantasy world while Germany burns." Rommel returned to France knowing the end was near. In a private letter to his wife, he wrote, "I have done everything possible to make him see reason. Now other means must be found." The failed meeting convinced the remaining conspirators that Hitler could neither be reasoned with nor educated about military reality. Their last hope for a peaceful transfer of power had evaporated in that conference room. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Field Marshal Walter Model faced his own crisis of conscience. Known as the Führer's fireman for his skill in desperate situations, Model surveyed the wreckage of Army Group Center in late June 1944. Soviet forces had annihilated 30 German divisions in what became known as the destruction of Army Group Center. Model understood this wasn't just another setback, it was the irreversible collapse of Germany's entire Eastern Front. His daily situation reports grew increasingly desperate. "Without immediate withdrawal, we will lose everything west of the Vistula. I beg authorization to save what remains of my command." Hitler's responses were always the same. "Not one step back, fight to the last man." Model, a loyal Nazi who had always followed orders without question, found himself confronting an impossible choice. In early July, he began authorizing limited withdrawals without Hitler's permission. The first time in his career, he had deliberately disobeyed an order. When confronted by staff officers about this unprecedented action, Model replied, "My duty is to save Germany, not to follow a madman into the abyss." His transformation from blind loyalist to pragmatic resistor demonstrated how deep the disillusionment had spread. Back in Berlin, the conspiracy gained new urgency. Stauffenberg's promotion to Chief of Staff of the replacement army gave him regular access to Hitler's military conferences. This provided the opportunity the conspirators had been waiting for. The Valkyrie plans were finalized, with every detail meticulously prepared. Government ministries, communication centers, SS headquarters, all would be seized simultaneously following Hitler's assassination. The goal was comprehensive, not just to kill the dictator, but to replace the entire Nazi leadership with a provisional government that could immediately seek peace. The economic situation reached catastrophic proportions in July 1944. German fuel production dropped to 25% of minimum military requirements. Panzer divisions reported 70% of their tanks immobilized. Aircraft production continued, but new planes couldn't fly for lack of aviation fuel. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled as transportation systems collapsed. The conspirators monitored these reports with mounting horror. They were racing against economic collapse as much as military defeat. General Beck noted in his diary, We have perhaps weeks, not months, before the entire front disintegrates from lack of supplies. On July 11, 1944, Stauffenberg attended a situation conference at the Berghof with a bomb in his briefcase. But at the last moment, he aborted the attempt when Himmler and Goering, his primary targets besides Hitler, failed to appear. The tension among the conspirators became unbearable. 8 days later, on July 19th, another opportunity arose. This time, Stauffenberg resolved to act regardless of who attended. His last words to fellow conspirators before departing for the Wolf's Lair were, "The time has come. May God protect Germany." The following day, July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg carried his briefcase bomb into Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair. The subsequent explosion ripped through the wooden barracks, and for a few precious hours, the conspirators believed they had succeeded. In Berlin, Operation Valkyrie was activated, but as the afternoon wore on, terrible news filtered through. Hitler had survived. The coup attempt collapsed amid confusion, betrayal, and tragic hesitation. That night, the first executions began. The regime's revenge would be swift, brutal, and comprehensive, destroying the last organized resistance within the German military and ensuring the total destruction the conspirators had sought to prevent. The phone rang in Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's headquarters at La Roche-Guyon just after midnight on July 21, 1944. The voice on the other end belonged to General Hans Speidel, his chief of staff, with words that turned Rommel's blood to ice. "Valkyrie has failed. Hitler lives." Rommel hung up the phone and stared into the darkness, knowing what this meant. As one of the conspiracy's key figures, even though he lay hospitalized from an Allied air attack on July 17th, his fate was sealed. The regime's vengeance would be merciless, and it would extend to anyone even remotely connected to the plot. The aftermath descended on Germany with terrifying speed. In Berlin, SS and Gestapo units moved with clinical efficiency, rounding up suspects based on lists prepared long in advance. The first wave of arrests netted over 200 officers by dawn. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army, who had hesitated fatally during the coup attempt, tried to save himself by ordering the immediate execution of Stauffenberg and 3 other key plotters. His desperate gesture failed. He was arrested hours later and would himself face execution months after. The message was unmistakable. Hesitation was as damning as action in Hitler's new order. Hitler's survival transformed him from increasingly unstable commander into vengeful avenger. That night, he recorded a radio address that would shock the nation with its venom. "A very small clique of ambitious, irresponsible, and stupid officers has plotted to eliminate me," he raged. "The circle these usurpers represents is very small. It has nothing to do with the German Wehrmacht, and especially not with the German people." This fiction, that the conspiracy involved only a handful of officers rather than representing widespread military opposition, became the regime's official line. But the scale of the subsequent purge betrayed the truth. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel presented the regime with its most delicate problem. As Germany's most famous soldier, he couldn't be dragged before the people's court like a common traitor. Instead, Hitler dispatched 2 generals to Rommel's home on October 14, 1944, with an ultimatum: face a show trial that would destroy his family, or take poison and receive a state funeral with full military honors. After a private conversation with his wife and son, Rommel made his choice. He left with the generals, and 15 minutes later, he was dead. The official announcement cited complications from his wounds, but every senior officer understood the truth. The Desert Fox had been murdered by the regime he once served so loyally. The judicial farce overseen by Judge Roland Freisler in the People's Court became the public face of Hitler's vengeance. The proceedings were carefully staged theater, designed to humiliate the accused while providing propaganda footage. Dignified generals were stripped of their medals and belts, forced to stand in shabby civilian clothes while Freisler screamed insults at them. There were no proper defenses, no appeals, only predetermined verdicts followed by immediate executions. The footage of these trials, filmed for Hitler's private viewing, shows Freisler's face contorted with hate as he condemns men who had served Germany for decades. By the time the purge concluded, over 7,000 arrests had been made, with approximately 4,980 executions. As the purge continued, the German military lost its most experienced leaders precisely when they were needed most. The Eastern Front collapsed with stunning speed as Soviet armies advanced toward Germany's borders. In the west, Allied forces broke out of Normandy and raced toward the Rhine. The very catastrophe the conspirators had tried to prevent now unfolded with gathering momentum. Without competent leadership, German defenses crumbled at an accelerating pace. Colonel General Kurt Zeitzler, who had replaced Halder as Army Chief of Staff, suffered a nervous breakdown and was dismissed. His replacement, Heinz Guderian, found himself commanding phantom armies from maps that bore little relation to reality. The economic situation reached its predictable conclusion. By September 1944, German fuel production dropped to 20% of requirements. Panzer divisions reported 80% of their tanks immobilized. The Luftwaffe could mount only token resistance to Allied bombing raids that now struck German cities at will. Ammunition shortages became so severe that artillery batteries received strict firing quotas, unable to respond to enemy barrages. The war economy, once the marvel of Europe, stood on the verge of total collapse. Armaments Minister Albert Speer's famous production miracles had been revealed as statistical tricks. The numbers looked impressive until one realized they measured production of increasingly obsolete weapons, while fuel to operate them didn't exist. Hitler's response to the military disasters was entirely predictable. He replaced professional soldiers with Nazi loyalists, men whose primary qualification was political reliability. Ferdinand Schörner, known for his brutality and blind loyalty, received command of army groups. The strategy of stand fast, regardless of circumstances, continued, resulting in the needless loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers in hopeless positions. The professional judgments the conspirators had fought to implement were ignored more completely than ever. When Guderian presented accurate situation maps showing the true disaster on the Eastern Front, Hitler accused him of treason and threatened him with execution. By December 1944, the consequences became undeniable. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, failed catastrophically, exactly as his professional officers had predicted. The German army expended its last reserves for no strategic gain. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces massed for their final offensive toward Berlin. The destruction the conspirators had sought to prevent now became inevitable. Their sacrifice, their warnings, their desperate gamble had changed nothing. Germany would pay the ultimate price for refusing to listen to reason when there had still been time to save something from the wreckage. The final Soviet offensive began on January 12, 1945, with a bombardment so massive it could be heard 100 miles away. 3 Soviet fronts comprising 2.5 million men shattered what remained of German defenses in the east. As the Red Army advanced toward Berlin at breathtaking speed, the ghost of the July 20th conspiracy haunted every headquarters. The professional soldiers who had tried to stop the madness watched helplessly as the catastrophe they predicted unfolded with mathematical precision. Every warning they had issued, every strategic assessment they had prepared, every desperate plea they had made, all proved devastatingly accurate. The Eastern Front collapsed exactly as Manstein had forecast when denied operational flexibility. The Western Front disintegrated exactly as Rommel had warned, without air support. The war economy strangled itself exactly as the staff officers had documented in their secret reports. The conspirators' legacy is etched in the ruins they tried to prevent. When Soviet soldiers fought their way into the Reich Chancellery in May 1945, they found a nation utterly destroyed, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure demolished, a generation of young men gone. The price for ignoring professional military judgment had been paid in full. The generals who joined the resistance had understood what their leader refused to acknowledge, that by 1944 the question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. Their failed attempt to seize control and negotiate peace condemned Germany to the unconditional surrender and total occupation they had sought to avoid. Historians would later debate whether the conspiracy could have succeeded had different choices been made, but the essential truth remains unchanged. These men represented the last voice of reason in a regime that had abandoned reality completely. They were not saints. Many had enabled Hitler's early successes and participated in his crimes, but their journey from loyal servants to determined resistors reveals the fundamental conflict between professional military judgment and ideological madness. They understood that leadership requires confronting reality, not denying it. That courage means acknowledging defeat when further resistance means national suicide. That true loyalty to one's country might require disobeying its leader. The tragedy of the German resistance lies not in its failure but in its timing. By the time senior officers resolved to act, Germany's fate had already been sealed at Stalingrad, Kursk, and in the bombing wreckage of its cities. The conspiracy became a desperate race against a clock that had already run out. Yet their warning echoes through history with enduring relevance. When leaders surround themselves with yes-men, when expertise is dismissed as defeatism, when ideology triumphs over evidence, catastrophe inevitably follows. The German generals of 1944 learned this lesson at the cost of their lives and their nation's destruction. Their story stands as an eternal reminder that some truths remain true, regardless of whether leaders choose to acknowledge them, and that reality always has the final word, no matter how passionately men might wish otherwise.